Hi everyone. So in this tutorial, we'll look at making our spaceship sprite move. As you'll recall in the last tutorial, we have created ourselves a spaceship class. And this is our spaceship class here. It inherits from the Pygame Sprite class. And in fact, a sprite object is simply a visible object on our screen. So our class inherits all the code there, although we can't see it. And then it is actually going to construct our spaceship at the X and Y position that we feed into it. And in the last lesson, you can see we created ourselves a spaceship object, which occurred when we were in the Start Game menu. We created the spaceship object, and then we've set the game state to now equal running, so it's no longer going to execute this code. So one of the things we don't want to do is create the spaceship object over and over again. I'm just going to minimize this bit of code because this is now the code that we're most interested in. We're interested in where we update the player sprite and we draw the player sprite. So we're now using our update and draw functions, and we're calling those functions from within the sprite itself. So the spaceship class, I'm just going to minimize its init function. The spaceship class has a draw function and an update function, and any object we create from that class is going to have those two functions. Currently, we're not doing anything with our update function. In fact, you'll probably just have pass there at the moment. However, I have kind of primed the update function to be able to handle user input. And you can see that the update function is expecting the list of keyboard presses, the mouse position, and the mouse buttons that are currently being pressed. And I'm passing that into my spaceship object from main. So you can see in my loop, this is my game loop, I'm actually going to collect user input. I'm collecting user input, and then when I want to update my player, I'm going to pass the user input to my player. I'm basically going to say, now update yourself. I want you to update yourself, and this is what the user has pressed or clicked. Okay, so that gives you an update. That gives you an overview of where we are going to go. What I do want to do is just give you a quick foundation on the positioning of our sprite. And in fact, the positioning of our sprite is always using an X and a Y value. Now, you've used X and Y in maths quite a lot, but we're going to refer to it in a different way. Our X and Y positioning is actually going to be referred to as a vector. And if we open up our init function, you'll see that I create two vectors. I create what's known as a vector2 for the direction, and I also set a vector2 for the position. By the way, I've also changed the speed to 3, and you'll see why that's relevant in a second. But these two things, the direction and the position, can be represented by what we call a vector, and it simply means that it has an X and a Y value inside it. The thing about a vector object in Pygame is it allows us to do some more complicated mathematics that I don't really want you to have to do yourself, which is why I've turned it into a vector object. But still, it's simply an X and a Y value. In terms of game development, we use vectors all the time. For example, if you have a position of a sprite on a screen, we represent it as a vector as in its position on that screen. So we've got here, according to this, and this is assuming that we've got 0, 0 in the middle, the position is represented by 2, 1. Now obviously in Pygame that's slightly different because we know that up here we're starting from 0, 0, and down here we're going to 1024 by 768. So relative to that origin, the values are going to be different, but the concept is still the same. You have a position that can be represented by an X and a Y value. Now, over on the right-hand side here, you can see I've got a direction. And a vector for a direction simply indicates what value X and Y is something going to move in. So what direction can we represent using an X and a Y value that it's going to move in? In this case here, if someone fired this gun, it's going to fire off a bullet in the X direction. It's going to go 1 unit to the X and 0 units to the Y. This plane over here, however, is moving -2 units in the X and 3 units in the Y. And it's going to do that every frame. So these vectors are how we represent movement in a 2D game. And the good thing about using a vector2 object is it means we can actually add them to each other very easily. So let's go to the update function. Now, I want to do 3 things. Firstly, let's just make it so we can make our ship move in a certain direction. So I'm going to set the direction to be a Pygame vector of 1, 0. That means 1 unit in the X position, which is going to go right. I'm just going to put in comments here, right. And 0 units in the Y position, which would be up and down. Then I'm going to update my position. I'm going to update my position to add the direction and then times that by the speed. Now, you're going to have to imagine how this would work. But let's just imagine you had, better yet, let's also look at the gun. The gun's position might be, well, let's just count it out from here. If the gun's position is 1, 1, and that's if I'm counting from the left-hand corner, and it fires off a bullet moving in the direction 1, 0, and let's just say the speed was 1, then it would move, the bullet would move 1 unit every frame. Now I'll say that again. You have your position. The position is then updated by the direction that something is traveling in, times by the speed at which it's traveling. So for us, what we're going to do is we're going to update the position with the direction times the speed. And I have set that speed to equal 3. So it should be moving at 3 pixels per second. And the direction I'm traveling in is simply going to be 1x and 0y. Now, the final thing you need to do in Pygame is you need to update the sprite's rectangle. The sprite's rectangle is the most important thing. So to update the sprite's rectangle, I'm going to set its center to equal my position's X and Y value. So the thing about here is self.position can actually return an X and a Y value. And once I do this, you should now find when I run my code that my spaceship is now floating across the screen. And I need to run it from main. I realize I can't, my main execution is in main. And you can see that it has now gone off my screen, which is exactly what I wanted. So it's taken my spaceship and flown across the screen. Now, I would suggest you play around with this. Maybe put in -1. -1 being the direction. The direction now will be left. And I'll put in 1, that being the Y value, in which case it should be going up. Now, the only thing I'd say here is you need to be aware how Pygame kind of flips the axis a bit. If you think about, I want you to think about what is the true Y direction in Pygame. Well, let's see what happens. I'm going to need to run the main. Okay, so you can see that it's definitely going to the left, but it's actually going down. And again, the reason for that is because 0, 0 is at the top of my screen and the Y value is actually down the bottom. So the actual Y-axis has been reversed. So if I want my spaceship to go up my screen, I have to actually change it to a -1 X position and a -1 Y position. I'll just get rid of the 0 so it doesn't go anywhere except up. So now if I run my code, again I've got to keep running it from main, you should see that the spaceship is going to go up, like so. Okay, so we've got our sprite moving, but what I'd like to do is make it so that we can control our sprite based on our keys. And as I suggested in the previous lesson, pressed is actually a series of keys, and we can actually identify which key has been pressed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this, because I've done it earlier, and I'm going to create myself an if-else block. I'm going to include an if-else block where it's simply going to look to see if the letter A has been pressed or the letter D has been pressed. And based on which one has been pressed, I can actually change my position, or direction, sorry. So I'm going to change my direction. My direction is equal to, self.direction is equal to Pygame vector -1. That's if it's an A, so it should move to the left. And it's going to be 1 if it's moving to the right. And then all I need to do is I can update my position. So I'm going to update my position. Position is equal to itself plus the speed times the direction. And then I update my rectangle. So now I've got it so that I can move my sprite around the screen. And what I'd like you to do for a challenge is see if you can also get W and S to move your sprite up and down. So that's your challenge at this point here. But if I run my code, you should be able to see that I can now control my spaceship using those keys. Like so. So now I can move my spaceship left and right. Okay. And I think that will, there's a few other things that we can do, but that will conclude our tutorial. Thank you very much for listening.